Design becomes a political act precisely because it's taking a situation, a current situation, and changing what is to what ought to be. And there's assumptions about what ought to be. And in that moment of change, you're contesting a current order, right? And so this becomes a political act. And so if you go into working with public partners with a particular agenda for social change, you might meet with resistance, and that agonistic, tense moment of contestation becomes this sort of moment of politics where politics happens. So you can be challenging the status quo as a designer, and this is what we're largely seeing in looking at sort of the design activity that's emerging at the intersection between design for social innovation and the public sector. So today I talked about 3 challenges or insights based on observation of a project that we ran at Parsons DESIS Lab, designing services for housing. And these 3 challenges that I talked about today were: 1 is acknowledging the political role of the designer in this context. 2 is the overcoming of epistemological barriers, which means basically different ways of knowing. For example, a more qualitative, designerly way of knowing a problem versus a more quantitative, rationalistic approach that you may see characteristic of a bureaucracy or public agency, right? And so how do you take these different ways of knowing and overcome them or work within them to make effective collaboration? And the 3rd is managing risk aversion, right? So you're talking about working with agencies that have high levels of public accountability, and so they need to be very careful on sort of how they take on new ideas and try things out, especially in working with a participatory design approach, which is essentially based on working with people and experimentation and exploration. And so how do you deal with risk-averse organizations when bringing a participatory design-based approach to an issue? I would be very skeptical to say or try to promote an idea saying how design could be more powerful or that design should be more powerful, but I think design is powerful, and it does have very real effects. And as designers enter into these new areas, it's important as scholars and practitioners to critically reflect on what's happening in these spaces. And so that's largely my project, is to understand how these socially and politically complex issues like healthcare, public policy, whatever, become problems that designers can act upon. How do they become design problems? So one of the important questions that for designers or designers who are working in the area of policy to debate or to keep clear and at the forefront of what their work is to think about this sort of in a critical way, the political implications of their work, and to ask about at whose service and at whose interests are being represented in their work, right? And how does the sort of space of engagement, the space of a project, structure the kinds of outcomes or the kinds of choices that are made within the project, right? So we don't design in a vacuum, right? And the sort of the social, political, ecological, and economic forces that run through the spaces we work in influence the types of choices we make in the design process, right? And so there needs to be a maintenance of a sort of space for critical reflexive practice, right, where designers could sort of step outside of the requirements of working for the project and meeting the deadline, and really think about how are the choices that we make structuring the ways in which we understand public problems. How are the people that we work with and our approaches structuring the way we understand these problems, and what influence does that have on the kinds of outcomes we're delivering? So what I'm really advocating for in so many words is to maintain this sort of maintain a space for critical reflexivity, right? To not be able to say, maybe what we're doing isn't working, or maybe, what interests are we aligning with?